Welcome. I'm Eric Fleming, host of A Moment with Eric Fleming, the podcast of our time. I want to personally thank you for listening to the podcast. If you like what you're hearing, then I need you to do a few things. First, I need subscribers. I'm on Patreon at patreon.com/A Moment with Eric Fleming. Your subscription allows an independent podcaster like me the freedom to speak truth to power and to expand and improve the show. Second, leave a 5-star review for the podcast on the streaming service you listen to it. That will help the podcast tremendously. Third, go to the website, momenteric.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast, leave reviews and comments, listen to past episodes, and even learn a little bit about your host. Lastly, don't keep this a secret like it's your own personal guilty pleasure. Tell someone else about the podcast. Encourage others to listen to the podcast and share the podcast on your social media platforms because it is time to make this moment a movement. Thanks in advance for supporting the podcast of our time. I hope you enjoy this episode as well. Hello, and welcome to another Moment with Eric Fleming. I am your host, Eric Fleming. And now I have fully recovered from the convention. It's time to get on with business as usual. And what better way to get back to business as usual is to have a familiar voice on the program. My good friend Will Cooper is coming on to talk about some stuff politically, but most importantly, he's written a new book, How America Works and Why It Doesn't. And anytime that this brother writes a book, I'm going to try to get him on the podcast. I think he's one of the best voices, maybe one of the most underrated political voices out there as far as observation and writing and all that. So it's always an honor to have him on. And I look forward to our discussion. But before we do any of that, it's time for a moment of news with Grace G.
Thanks, Eric. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. ended his presidential campaign and endorsed Donald Trump. Democrats sued Georgia's state election board over new measures they claim could disrupt the election certification process. U.S. Special Counsel Jack Smith urged an appeals court to revive the criminal case against Donald Trump for keeping classified documents after a lower court dismissed it. Donald Trump faces a new federal indictment related to his efforts to overturn the 2020 election, with prosecutors focusing on his actions as a political candidate. 2 members of Donald Trump's campaign staff were involved in an altercation with an Arlington National Cemetery official over filming during a wreath-laying ceremony. Multiple U.S. Secret Service agents have been placed on leave following the assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump in Pennsylvania. A second former Memphis police officer pled guilty to federal charges related to the beating death of Tyree Nichols. A federal judge dismissed part of the most serious charge against 2 former Louisville officers accused of falsifying a search warrant leading to Breonna Taylor's death. A former Florida sheriff's deputy was charged with manslaughter for the shooting death of Roger Forston. Steve Bannon will face trial in New York on fraud charges related to fundraising for Trump's border wall. A U.S. appeals court upheld Maryland's handgun licensing law, supporting its validity despite an earlier Supreme Court decision expanding gun rights. A federal appeals court ruled against Missouri's law that tried to invalidate several federal gun laws. U.S. consumer confidence hit a 6-month high in August, and the Federal Housing Finance Agency reported a slight dip in single-family home prices in June. I am Grace G., and this has been A Moment of News.
All right. Thank you, Grace, for that moment of news. And it's good to have you back. Now, it is time for my friend, Will Cooper. William Cooper is an attorney, national columnist, and award-winning author. His last 2 books are Stress Test: How Donald Trump Threatens American Democracy, and his new book, How America Works and Why It Doesn't. Will's commentary has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, San Francisco Chronicle, Baltimore Sun, New York Daily News, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, USA Today, New York Times, CNN, Washington Post, Chicago Sun-Times, Huffington Post, and the Dallas Morning News. Publishers Weekly calls his writings about American politics a compelling rallying cry for democratic institutions under threat in America. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest again on this podcast, Will Cooper. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, an old friend of the program has come back. Will Cooper. How you doing, Will? You doing good?
Doing great, Eric. Great to be back. It's been too long. I feel like it's been even over a year, so I'm glad to be here.
Well, it gave you time to write this new book, America Works and Why It Doesn't. And last time you were on, you had written a book, and so I wanted to get you on to talk about this, and I always appreciate your enthusiasm for coming on the show. So I've got 2 different quotes I'm going to run by you. The first one
Great.
is the greatness of America lies not in being more enlightened than any other nation, but rather her ability to repair her faults. What does that quote mean to you, especially in the context of today?
Well, that is how I closed the book, with that quote. Talking about that quote. That's from Alexis de Tocqueville. It's a very, very important quote to me when it comes to American politics and our history. I think our history is one of great progress and then also steps backward, right? A lot of great things happen and the trend lines move up, and it's never linear, and there's always lots of good and bad together. But our history is one of moving forward and then taking a step back and then moving forward again, from a very high level perspective. And in my view, this century, the 21st century, we're in a decline. Our overall approach to not everything's bad. It's always a mix of good and bad, but our overall trend line as a political unit, as a polity, is moving backwards this century. And so the key question for me with that quote is that still true? Is it still true that we have this strain in our polity of repairing our faults and getting better and overcoming them? Or alternatively, is this just the beginning of a long decline, and we won't go back to where we were, and we won't continue to move forward over the long arc of history? So it's a very, very important quote for me, and I appreciate you coming right out with it.
Well, Tocqueville, it was, just his history, the concept of somebody from another country just coming, and at the time frame, America was relatively young at that point, and coming from France, which was a major ally in the United States securing its independence, to just commit to come and I just want to see what this America is about, right? I just want to see what's going on. And it's amazing that somebody nearly 250 years ago nailed the essence of what America is about. So, but usually, great observation and great literature that usually stands the test of time. But there's another quote I wanted to, from the book that I saved up, and it says, William Cooper is one of the most insightful writers covering politics in America today. It has been a privilege to have him as a guest on my podcast, and I am grateful someone like William is chronicling these volatile times. It sounds like a pretty smart dude that wrote that. What's your take on that quote?
The only man standing above de Tocqueville and the founding fathers in terms of their genius and insight into our system is the man who uttered that quote, Mr. Eric Fleming. Well, let me read you a third quote that you might not have seen.
Okay.
And this is from the acknowledgments, if you haven't seen it. Quote, Eric Fleming, moreover, doesn't just host the best political podcast in the world. He's also a deeply intelligent and wise thinker about America and why it isn't working, end quote. I don't know if you saw that, but that's there too.
Yeah. I was trying not to do too much self-aggrandizement, but I greatly appreciate that. But I hold you in higher esteem than me because you are truly an observer, right? And it's like I'm in the fray. I've been in the fray. I've been an elected official. When I was meeting people at the convention and people would ask me, well, why did you start a political podcast? And all that stuff. And when I go through my background, they're looking at me like, dude, where have you been? Who are you? You know what I'm saying? I mean, other people I met, like, for example, Andrew Gillum. And I don't know if that name sounds familiar to you, but that was the gentleman that ran against DeSantis the first time and should have beat him in the Florida gubernatorial race. And, I knew about him, but he didn't really know about me. So when we talked and I talked to him about my background, all that, he was just like, he didn't want to leave. You know what I'm saying? It was like he wanted to just kind of pick my brain and just chop it up. And that's usually what happens. And that's why I felt I needed to do this show, was to bring that kind of perspective to the discussion, somebody that's actually been in the middle of it. And I don't know if I could have made it in this particular time, because when I explain to people, I've been out of politics as far as elected office for like 20 some years. So, that's a long time in politics, and you address a lot of that in the book as far as the concepts and all that. But before we get into the book, I wanted to get your takeaways about the convention. I watched the Republican convention and it actually was at the Democratic convention. I'm biased. I think the Democratic convention was phenomenal. I think it did everything it was supposed to do. And looking at the poll numbers, it definitely did what it set out to accomplish, because going into the Democratic convention, it was still kind of an unknown. Vice President Harris, even though she's been a national figure, was still kind of a mystery. And the poll numbers reflected that. Now we're seeing polls, even Fox News is showing that she's ahead, not only in the national polling, but in some key swing states. As an outside observer, what was your take on the two conventions?
Well, I thought two main thoughts. First one is, I thought the Democratic convention was extremely well done, very effective. I really enjoyed it. I thought numerous speeches were fantastic, and it was just very well produced, and effective. Like you said, it was just effective. achieved its goals. I didn't think the Republican convention was as effective, but I thought they did a good job. I mean, I thought it was the organization behind it in general was pretty good. I certainly disagreed with more of the substance, but it wasn't some train wreck like some might have expected. Trump's speech was a little out there, but it would have been surprising if it wasn't. Whereas Kamala was, she's showing that she actually is a good candidate. After her earlier presidential campaign 4 years ago, where she did not perform very well, she's showing that she's able to run a really good campaign. I think that was exemplified by her speech. So those were my takeaways this year. But then I always go back with conventions to a lesson I learned 8 years ago that will stick with me. I remember in 2016, the Republican convention really was, I just thought it was a total train wreck. It was completely disorganized. It was, weird. It wasn't well done at all. They actually improved a lot. I felt like this year. And the Democrats convention in 2016 was fantastic. Very well done. Michelle Obama gave an incredible speech, and Hillary did a good job. And it was just like this beautifully orchestrated convention. And the contrast between the two then was enormous. And then we saw the results. So I always feel, conventions are kind of like preseason. I'm a big football fan. I think you might be a football fan too. They kind of remind me of preseason football, where everybody oohs and ahs as things happen. But then when it's week 17 and you look back at preseason, it didn't mean anywhere near as much as you thought. So I temper my judgments with that lesson.
Yeah, and the whole concept of conventions is each party is supposed to present their best face. They're supposed to throw out their platform. These are the issues. I think 2016 was the for the Republicans this was the first Trump one. And nobody, not even in the Republican side, with all the people that were running and the history of all those people that were running. I mean, Rubio, you had a Bush, you had, U.S. senators running, Cruz, Graham, all these folks. It was like for Trump to emerge out of that, and the way that he did it, the convention was they were just trying to figure out what exactly is our identity. And it was very evident, whereas the Democrats knew from day one, once Joe Biden said as a sitting vice president, I'm not going to run, and open the door for Hillary, then it was like, they had time to cater it to what Hillary Clinton wanted. What I always say about Hillary Clinton, and this is out of respect for all the things that she has achieved, Hillary Clinton, when you look at it historically, objectively, was probably one of the worst presidential candidates ever to run. Because in 2008, she was supposed to win, and Barack Obama beat her in the primary. And 2016, she got the nomination, and she was supposed to dog walk this misogynist, crazy real estate tycoon from New York, and she didn't. And those were, to me, I mean, there were some dynamics in the demographic. I mean, 53% of her demographic didn't vote for her. That's a major flaw to me, and that's even a bigger flaw than Al Gore not winning Tennessee, right, when he ran. But just the fact that there were things that she didn't do as a candidate, like she didn't show up in Flint, Michigan, when that was like one of the biggest stories in America at that time. And that was a city that would have gravitated to her, right? So, I mean, just stuff like that makes me critical of her. But watching what happened live and in person in Chicago, and watching what happened with the Republicans, which you have to give the Republicans credit, because literally 2 days before the convention convened, they almost didn't have a candidate. that kid gets lucky, in his mindset. If he's more accurate, Donald Trump is not showing up on Monday. So, for the Republicans to even pull that off less than 48 hours after that event and still reflect, what that candidate wanted, has to be respected, regardless of how you feel about their platform and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, the Democrats, the energy, all that stuff, I just felt that they did exactly what they had to do in the situation they were in. And it was almost like Kamala had been running for a whole year as opposed to literally like weeks before that convention happened.
Yeah, it's been very impressive to see how well they're doing, how quickly. I didn't know for sure before. I fully admit I did not know, 2 weeks before Biden resigned when we were all speculating. I didn't know, okay, if Kamala gets it, what'll happen? Will it be good? Will it be bad? How will it go? And in terms of their ability to have an effective campaign and do it quickly and a really good convention and have just do a good job with the operation of the campaign, I've been very impressed.
Yeah, it was almost like kind of plug and play. I think they had it set up for Biden because their whole mission was to put Biden in the best light possible. And then you switch up and it's like, oh, well, we got an even more dynamic candidate than what we were gearing for. So, this ought to amp it up even more. And that's exactly what happened. You real quick, you've been around her, I guess. I don't know if you were there. Well, were you there when she was like a local elected official, like as the DA and the Attorney General and all that?
Yeah, I don't want to overstate it, but I was. So she was the district attorney of San Francisco when I was in law school and I just graduated. So I knew her then. I had a sense of who she was then. She then became California Attorney General while I was a young lawyer. As a young lawyer, my head was down in my files more than in the newspaper. Thankfully, things have improved. Things have improved on that front dramatically for me. But I was familiar with her. And then I have a funny story. So when I was in my 5th year out of law school, I was interviewing at law firms to go to a new firm, and Kamala had just announced that she was, or just won her U.S. Senate seat. So I was bouncing around San Francisco, where she lives, and and I walk in one day for an interview at this law firm, and I sit down, and the head lawyer of the office is going to meet with me, and he walks in, and it's Doug. So I sat down with who at the time, great guy. We had an hour-long conversation, super personable, super smart. He was the head of the office at a really good firm. And at the time I thought, wow, this is really cool. I'm interviewing here with the husband of a senator. And little did I know he'd soon be, the husband of a vice president, and now on the cusp of being, the husband of the president. So I did get a firsthand experience with him as a lawyer, and he's a really, really nice, smart, personable guy. So it was a fun interview.
Yeah, but he didn't hire you, so maybe he might not have a good eye for talent. But that's a whole nother conversation for another day. I won't hold that against him if you won't.
I'll blame me, not him. How's that?
All right, so there's something I want to get off my chest before we get to the book real quick, and that's this deal with the Arlington National Cemetery. I don't know if you've picked up on it or not, but supposedly a Gold Star family invited Donald Trump to show up at the at the cemetery for I guess it's the 3-year anniversary of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so they decided to have a memorial service there, and one of the families invited Donald Trump to come as their guest. And that could have been, pretty cool, pretty solemn, except it's Donald Trump. And so chaos followed. And next thing you know, we got staffers fighting employees at the cemetery, and videos are taken, and you got a governor using it in a fundraising speech, and the rules clearly say you're not supposed to be doing political stuff at Arlington National Cemetery. And then Trump, in an interview last night, said, "Oh, I didn't know the rules." What's your take on that, man? Because I'm just like, yeah. What's your take on it? Calm me down a little bit.
It's Trump being Trump. I mean, he is who he is. We know exactly who he is. He is, wildly unfit to be president of the United States for many, many, many reasons, including just a total lack of respect and empathy for really profound elements in our country and our history. And that's just an example. And the longer he's in the public scene, either as a candidate, hopefully not official again, but as long as he's around, he's just going to be doing stuff like that. And he surrounds himself with people that support it. This is just him being himself. It's what he does. And it's shocking and terrible. And we can never, get used to it. He's a raging outlier, and we always need to remember that. So I think your outrage is totally proportional to a very scientific and objective assessment of the facts.
Yeah. So that leads into the book, because there's a couple of questions based off of that. To me, it doesn't seem rational for people to support a guy who is disrespectful of the concept of America, who doesn't respect its institutions, has publicly said, yeah, do away with the Constitution. Real quick, I used to joke with people when he was president, I would visit D.C., I would say, I got to get to the archives building. They say, why? Because I got to make sure the Constitution is still on display, right? I mean, that's how serious a threat I thought he was. And, but these people just believe that this guy who wants to be hang out and grew up as a rich person, as a well-to-do person, these people believe that he is their answer, and they trust him. And it's not like he's some guy that never got the job. He had 4 years to show what he could do, and he didn't deliver for them. And so, but they have this irrational belief that things were better when he was there. So you talk about irrationality in the book. Kind of go into why do you think we have this irrationality? What do you think the root causes are?
Well, I think you're right. And I think even more disturbing in a lot of ways than the things Trump does is the fact that tens of millions of Americans love him and support him, and that he's the Republican nominee and has a close to a 50% chance of going back, despite what he's done. And I don't think I think you have to give Republicans some leeway to support candidates who have, a checkered history or aren't the best people, because, just like Democrats, they care about their issues. And, the Democrats would take a pretty wacky guy or gal as president if they got 3 Supreme Court justices out of it. So I don't think you could I think you need to remember that Republicans care deeply about the issues. And so to some extent, they're going to put up with a lot. But what's really striking to me is Trump just goes so far beyond what is worth it in that trade-off. He was at, really, really for months, not just on January 6th, but for months, fundamentally trying to overturn an election and thwart the peaceful transfer of power, which is the first principle of our system. That's the premise of American government. Everything flows. We reorganize government after an election to reflect the will of the people. Everything flows from that. So it's a real sign of irrationality. Now, to actually answer your question, what's the root cause? I mean, the biggest thing I tried to do with the book was assess the root cause. Why are we here? And I think there's 3 elements working together. The first is age-old cognitive bias that everybody has. Humans are tribal by nature. It's always been that way. It always will. That's one element. Second element is new, right? The last 25 years, we have an internet. And now we have social media and all these echo chambers where you can confirm those biases. You can listen to the podcasts you like, ignore the ones you don't, and so on. And then the third element is the political system. When you've got all of this tribalism going strong, you want a political system that would tamp that down. And ours does the opposite. It turbocharges those passions with Democrat and Republican super rivalry, and then the other issues with closed primaries and gerrymandering. So to me, the root cause is a flywheel that consists of those 3 elements.
Yeah, and I always have to, being a former politician, I've participated in that redistricting / gerrymandering process, and it becomes like a real game. And I think, as somebody has been through it, I think if we can get away from the actual elected officials deciding what districts they run in, I think that would be, a step leaps and bounds. I think states like Mississippi, Iowa, places where, certain populations are, congested, I guess, for lack of a better term, congregated. Yeah, let's use that term. They would have a better chance to get representation. I'm glad that the U.S. Supreme Court recognized that Alabama deserves a second congressional district that could be represented by an African American. But, it shouldn't have to go to court. It should be independent groups to, just, if we need to have AI for something, maybe we just need AI for that. You know what I'm saying? Just, something totally objective. Yeah, just something totally objective. Ain't nobody got no feelings in it. It's just, this is the way the district should be done, and you have equal population, and then, just go from there.
It's a real abomination. Gerrymandering is just an open affront to democracy that just right in plain sight. It's really unfortunate.
Yeah. So you talk about, the title of the book is How America Works and Why It Doesn't. Talk about, to me, I could very easily, as somebody that is a historical Democrat, Donald Trump is the reason why it's not working now. But objectively, as you spell out in the book, why do you think that the system, America, is not working the way that it should?
Well, I think the rampant tribalism that's rooted in those 3 elements, right? In bias, social media, the internet, and in the political system have just combined to render a huge percentage of the country on both sides, really irrational. I think Republicans are a lot worse, but I do think there's some particularly at the extreme side of the Democratic, the left side of the aisle. There's some pretty irrational views and actors as well. Trump is the single biggest element, right? He's the single biggest ingredient. He stirs things up in a really dramatic way. But I don't think he's, he's, as is a common way to put it, I think he's a symptom. He's a big symptom. And if if he loses in a few months and leaves the scene, that'll do a lot of good. But at the end of the day, half the country is supporting him. What does that say about what does it say that 75 million people are going to cast a vote in an American election for a guy who tried to overturn the last one? It means something deeper and broader is afoot than just him.
Yeah, well, I don't think it's going to be that close where he can try to do what he did, last election. I that's just me.
Won't have the power of incumbency either, thankfully.
Yeah. And and then to be honest, the power of incumbency is on the vice president's side as opposed to, what Donald Trump had. And
yes, thankfully.
Yeah. So, we'll see. You real quick, you talked about things that you didn't like about the Constitution, slavery, and the slavery clause, the 3/5 clause, and the Second Amendment. Slavery, from my perspective, is pretty obvious. 3/5 is pretty obvious. The Second Amendment, kind of explain why you think that was a bad thing about the Constitution, and then tell me something about the Constitution that you like.
So my views on the Second Amendment are almost sure to ruffle the feathers of almost everybody I talk about it with, because I think about it in two ways that don't typically travel together. So on the one hand, I do think it's a valid constitutional amendment. It's been interpreted broadly by the Supreme Court, but so have lots of other provisions been interpreted by the Supreme Court that people that don't like the Second Amendment are happy about. The Supreme Court in the Warren era even invented things not there, and people support that. I don't think it's good for our system to have an interpretive philosophy from our judges that zigs and zags everywhere. I think you should be accurate, proportional, and try to just have the same application of the law, whether you like a constitutional provision or you don't like. I think that's a healthy form of democracy, and let the elected officials, set policy and the American people express their will through them, as opposed to judges flipping and flopping around. So I disagree with those who think the Second Amendment should be rendered a nullity. I don't think that's right. It's there. I think it was, however, I think the founders made a mistake by including it and writing it the way they did. It's very ambiguous, but it's kind of odd how it's been written. And I think the consequences, while it's a legally legitimate part of the Constitution, it's there, and it's okay for the Supreme Court to say that. The consequences have been horrible. It's a big part of our culture of guns and violence. It's not the only thing. I mean, we also have the corporatization of the gun industry and the NRA and other things. But the Second Amendment is a big part of the culture of guns and violence in this country that has led us to have the worst incidence of gun deaths of any developed Western democracy by quite a bit, by a pretty hefty margin. So I think it's a legitimate provision, but it's a mistake. It was a mistake, and it's one that stuck for a very long time. The second part of your question, what do I like about the Constitution? So I say in the book how it's this irony of history that the same document that had these horrible abominations and big mistakes, also sets forth a structure of government that has increased human flourishing in a very dramatic way. And it's been replicated in lots of other countries to increase human flourishing there. And I think our system of separation of powers, federalism, bicameral legislation, an independent judiciary, that whole system of separating out authority and harnessing the sort of inherent rivalries in government instead of having power reposed in one place, like history would typically have with a king, we've divided it out in a variety of ways. And I think that that structure has been profoundly positive for the way humans live and function together.
All right, so I got a couple more questions. You talk about there's three traditions that's not necessarily in the Constitution, but they're central to what defines us as American. One is the concept of America itself, and the other two is like the two-party system and capitalism. How they doing? Because there's a lot of people. There's a lot of people that question all of that, right? With the two-party system, they feel that there's no chance for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. or Cornel West or Jill Stein to have equal footing, not unless they have money like Ross Perot, which ties into the capitalism piece. I ran into protesters, at the convention, and a lot of them were saying capitalism is the reason why the system is corrupt. I've had people come on the podcast that basically said we can't have a fair representative system because of capitalism. And then there are some people that believe that America is never going to live up to the ideal. It's never going to live up to its creed. So why not change the concept? What's your thoughts about that?
Great question. I think the two-party system has been a huge part of our history, and I strongly support reforming that. I think a more diverse system of parties would be very positive for addressing some of our biggest problems. Getting a multiplicity of views out there would be so healthy for the debate. I mean, there are huge, important issues that if the Democrats or the Republicans aren't into them, they're just off the table. And it's not the world's not binary. There's lots of different ways to think about things. It wouldn't solve all of our problems, and depending on how it played out, it could even make things worse potentially. But getting more diverse marketplace of parties, I think, would be great. So I think in that sense, it's a negative for our country. But it's obviously been a very central part of our history. Capitalism, to me, the excesses of capitalism are a big problem. I think the inequality that we see is really unfortunate. In the same country, you've got people worth $200 billion, and then you've got tens of millions of people struggling to have food and shelter, a reliable source of food and shelter. That's insane. I mean, that's this money just sitting idly in these accounts and fluctuating by $1 billion a day in people that will never see it could produce so much good for people. So I would favor, some real redistribution at the extremes. But the core of capitalism, I think, is a good thing. I think we've got excesses that can be fixed, but I do think having entrepreneurial people out there doing things with the part of the motivation being that they'll get ahead and they'll be rewarded actually harnesses human nature in a good way. So if we could decrease the degree of inequality, I think it would be a good thing. We also need more regulations with respect to the environment and some other areas. But at its core, I think the impulse is a good one and it's a helpful one. And then the third one, with the main idea I had with the third element was the rule of law and how important that is to our country, because it's not you can't just put in the Constitution a provision that says everybody will follow this faithfully, and all the laws that are passed in local jurisdictions and developed in local people will adhere to that and follow that faithfully. Excuse me. You actually have to have an ethos that respects the rule of law. And historically, compared to other countries, and compared to other countries today, we still have it. That's been a key driver of our success, in my opinion. We've had horrific abuses, don't get me wrong, but a general ethos among people that there are laws that should be followed. If you look at some other countries, they're in really bad shape, and it hinders their development. So, but I think Donald Trump, among others, I think, contributing to a fraying of that, which is a real concern. So that's how I think of those. Each one is obviously a huge topic, but that's the high level.
Yeah. I mean, you can do a show on each one of those. So I look at your book as a wake-up call, right? I love the way that you laid the foundation in the first part of the book, explaining about the Constitution and all that, and then going into, the challenges, what has been happening recently. But how I want to close the Q&A part is, what is the biggest threat to democracy that can be easily fixed?
Great question. The single biggest thing that we could do that would move the needle quickly and that's attainable would be to send Trump packing in November. That's hardly a novel idea. It's hardly creative, but it's true. Sometimes the truth is obvious. Sometimes it's not. That's the single biggest thing we could do. Get him off the scene. He takes an underlying climate and underlying sort of tectonic problems and makes them dramatically worse. We would still have challenges, of course, but that would be the single biggest thing we could do to revert in the direction of the mean. I feel like we're very far from the mean in American politics. I mean, look where we were 10 years ago. There was all sorts of kooky dysfunction, but it was so much more normal than it is now. So that's the answer. I mean, that's the single biggest thing we could do. We'd still have a bunch of problems. We'd still have to sort a lot of things out. Who emerged as the Republicans' champion would be an important question. But I think Trump's such an outlier that whoever takes that mantle from him, there's a very high likelihood that they're better for the country than Trump, even if they're have problems and are concerning. I think there's a huge likelihood they're better than Trump. So that's the biggest thing we can do.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think that, the fact that he's been in the limelight for a generation, that there's going to be a lot of residue, right? That has to be cleaned up.
Yeah.
But, I think that him not being the titular head of a political party, him not being, he's done something that, he's a historical figure whether we like him or not. He got more votes than any other incumbent in the history of the United States. Even though he lost the election, he got 75 million votes. That's historic. He's the first man in the modern era. I don't think William Jennings Bryan did it consecutively. He may have. But he's the only one I know that won his party's nomination 3 election cycles in a row. So that's a lot of residue. That's going to have to be clean.
I don't think there's ever been a more dominant primary than the one we just had either. I've never seen that. It was just game over before it even started.
Yeah. And so I think that, I agree with your diagnosis, doctor, but we're going to have to get the Mayo Clinic of politics to really come with a cure for that. So, where can people get this book? How America Works and Why It Doesn't? And if people want to get in touch with you, my friend, how can they do that?
Yeah, so anywhere online. It's at a lot of bookstores, but the easiest way to do it is online. Just plug it into Google, and it'll come up. If you Amazon, of course, but if you're another bookseller, it's on all of them, all the main ones. I have a website, will-cooper.com, will-cooper.com, and love to interact with people, love to talk these things through, as you know, Eric. So, anybody interested in connecting, just reach out. The website's probably the easiest way to do it.
All right. Well, Will, as always, my friend, it's an honor to have you come on. I am really honored that not only have you been a good and frequent guest, but but you've been a supporter of the podcast. I appreciate the kind words that you put in the book, and that you've extolled to other people, and I appreciate your enthusiasm. But more importantly, and I've said this before, I appreciate the way that you look at things. It's very hard in this day and age to really find somebody to look at the political system not only in an objective fashion, but then to be able to articulate it so that people can understand. And I think that's really, really key. So I'm praying that this book is a New York Times bestseller, not just for your personal financial reasons, but that people need to have this. People need to read it and get a basic understanding of why this country is great and why it can be better, right? And a lot of folks that I know is like, man, I don't even know why you got into politics. I had people tell me I was wasting my time being a political science major, but I'm telling you, as a black person in America, this system is an incredible opportunity. And the only way that we can take advantage of that opportunity is that opportunity still exists. And I think people like you and others that offer legitimate critiques of where we are and what we can do is very, very important. So I thank you most importantly for that. So I appreciate, and as always, I appreciate you coming on the podcast. All right. I may have lost them at the end. But again, I thank Will for coming on, and we'll catch y'all on the other side. All right, and we are back. So again, I want to thank Will for coming on. Not only to talk about his book, but just to give his observations. He's really, really a very, very deep writer and thinker, but he's also a solid dude. And like I stated, in the interview, he's been a big supporter of the podcast. And I am always thrilled to have him on. And, as long as I've got this podcast, he definitely has an open invitation, as any other guest that's been on. But Will has definitely taken advantage of that, and I am very, very grateful. Now, before I get off the air, something has really, really been on my mind, and I've kind of touched on it a little bit, on different shows and all that kind of stuff. But, I went to this Democratic convention, and I was really impressed with how the party put it together, considering short notice. And if you heard it, in the interview, I gave respect to the Republicans for dealing with a situation and pulling off their convention as well. But, coming back from the convention, I didn't really follow social media while I was there, but I followed it when I got back. And, maybe it's not healthy. I'm on as many social media platforms as I possibly can because I'm trying to promote the show, as always, right? But, outside of that, I'm really not trying to engage with a lot of people. Every now and then I get a spur and answer my pants, as the old folks used to say, and I'll respond to certain things. But, one of the things that came out after the convention was I noticed there were a lot of people, especially people of color, but not limited to them, who just felt like they just had to bitch and complain about something. That, just had to air every grievance, no matter how minute or whatever. And maybe these folks are like me, that, that's their therapy, right? This podcast is my therapy. I tell people that all the time. But, maybe social media is their therapy. I don't know. But see, unlike them, right? If there are people that disagree with my position or we have an opposite view of a position on an issue, they are welcome to come on this podcast. The door is open. All we got to do is find a time slot for us to record the interview. That's it. That's the only restriction, and my experience has been that people have been polite. We may not sway each other's mindset one way or the other, but at least they came on and they had an opportunity to say what they needed to say on their position. Just recently, right, I've had people on different sides of the Israeli-Hamas conflict, for example, or people that have different positions on the legalization of marijuana, for example. Regardless of my position on it, both sides had, I think, their best spokespersons, right, come on and talk about why they feel the way that they feel. And that, to me, is what American politics is supposed to be about. In the theme of having Will come on and talk about how America works and why it doesn't, one of the things I think that it's not working the way it should is because we've given too much leverage to who I am going to classify as grievance pimps. These are people that, I'm twisting a phrase from back in the day. I remember when people used to be critical of folks like Jesse Jackson Sr. or Reverend Sharpton or anybody else that would come to places where they were having a major conflict, especially dealing with race or dealing with economics. And they would say to these people, swoop in and they get all the spotlight and all this stuff. And, or certain elected officials get in, and they used to call them poverty pimps, right? Because they said, well, these folks are just taking advantage of, a situation, and they just trying to get attention. And what really these people were doing, and Attorney Crump is in that same mode, Ben Crump, is that they're using their cachet to bring national attention to that issue, right? Because nobody would have cared about an MCI meeting with Bernie Ebbers in Jackson, Mississippi, if Reverend Jackson didn't show up as a shareholder and talk about why these employees are not union members, right? And fight for better wages for these people. It just would have been another board meeting in a state where people were falling in love with this guy. I mean, before he got indicted and convicted, they were talking about Bernie Ebbers being governor of Mississippi, right? And, Reverend Jackson came down and basically said, hey, well, before y'all start coronating this guy, he needs to be paying his folks fairly for the work that they're doing compared to AT&T and other companies, right? So, when you have people like that, and then Ben Crump, with all these excessive force uses by police that have led to tragic consequences, right? Black men and women dying. Ben Crump showing up brings the media. And once the media latches on to it, then it's his own entity. And sometimes the family retains him as lead counsel, and sometimes they just have him as an advisor. But nonetheless, he's utilizing his cachet to bring highlight to an issue. He doesn't need the relevance. As a matter of fact, what I've noticed that he's done is that because of his strong relationship with the National Bar Association, is that he brings in other attorneys. He highlights black attorneys in those particular areas and say, hey, look, y'all, these folks can handle on the ground. All I want to do is make sure that you get the media attention that you need to fight this fight, right? That's not pimping at all. That's using the power of your celebrity to help people that need the help. When I talk about grievance pimps, and especially in this age of social media, I'm talking about people who get on platforms just to be contrarian, just to say something so they can get some clicks, so they can get some likes. Even if they may have a legitimate issue or gripe to deal with, they have bad timing as far as the relevance of that particular issue. And two, all they're trying to do is to get attention to them. They're not trying to solve the problem. They're just trying to make sure that they have a strong following so they can get whatever revenue is attached to that, notoriety attached to that, try to monopolize and say they're the authority on a particular issue when they're not, right? Because most of the time they don't have the facts. They're very opinionated. And in this country, you're allowed to be opinionated. But it would help if you had some facts. But, the ultimate grievance pimp, I'll get to in a moment, but I'm talking about these people of color. And I don't want to call them out by name, because I'm not really trying to be petty or start a personal war, and it's more than just one or two people. It's a lot of folks. It's men, it's women, it's black, it's Latino, it's Asian, whatever. It's a bunch of folks. And they throw out this red meat to get people riled up. They throw out this misinformation to get people riled up so people can follow them and catch their live X Twitter feed or Instagram or Clubhouse or chat or whatever they on, to just ingratiate themselves and not really do anything to help the issue. And the one issue that really pisses me off that this is happening is dealing with reparations. And I take it very personally because I'm a black man. And I have always believed that the United States needs to repair the damage that's been done to black people historically. We know historically there have been some efforts to do that, especially right around the Civil War and Reconstruction era, but they weren't sustained because white privilege and power, white supremacy shut it down, right? And every battle we have fought has been just to get some modicum of respect and some peace and tranquility, right? But it's always fallen short of repairing the economic damage. And so there have been some efforts. There are people like Ebony Reed and Lisa Story who are going around and I want to say John Hope Bryan. If I got his name wrong, I apologize. But there's been people like that that have been going around the country talking about Cam Howard, how Ron Daniels. There have been people that have been going around for years to talk about the wealth gap and how we as African Americans need to better understand the capitalistic system to maintain and sustain and follow the biblical principle of living life and living it abundantly, right, within this society. And even to the point where, some of these people, like Alderwoman Simmons up in Evanston, Illinois, who actually got reparations, or the mayor of Stockton, California, who's actually paying people a subsidy that are low income, that are TANF recipients, to try to get them out of poverty. And those are former reparations, and those are actions, right? And there's been groups forever. Like when, I was young, I didn't realize I was part of the formation, but I was part of the formation of the NCOBRA, National Coalition of Blacks, or Black Reparations in America, right? Back in like the late 80s. So, this is something that's near and dear to me. And what really kind of triggered me to say something was, I've been watching the movement of people trying to end the genocide that is happening in Gaza. And I can fully say that now. It's like, genocide is a strong word, but based on what the Israeli government has done recently by now launching raids and attacks in the West Bank, which had nothing to do with Hamas, because whatever basic understanding that people have about that conflict historically, Hamas has been centered in Gaza. It's been the Palestinian Authority that's been running the West Bank. And they had nothing to do with October 7th. But because now Netanyahu is in the same position as Trump, by the way, that the longer he's in power, he doesn't go to jail. Then they've escalated it now to the West Bank, which at this point, it makes the Republic of South Africa look like geniuses by calling it and getting the World Court to call it what it was, International Court, as genocide. Right? So these young people in the United States, and some older ones too, are mobilizing people to deal with this issue, right? They're not just on social media just to grieve. They're, to express their outrage. They're taking action. And so when Vice President Harris gave her speech to accept the Democratic nomination, there were literally over 23,000 people in the United Center. It's a lot of folks, right, in one spot. How about that Monday at Union Park, about a mile or so away from the United Center? There were 20,000 people at the park. And they marched down to the United Center based on this issue of the genocide that's going on in Gaza. And, with all due respect to those folks who support Israel and of the Jewish faith and all that stuff, if you're offended by me calling it a genocide, I'm sorry that you feel that way, but I have to just call it like I see it. So that's that. And again, I've had the general counsel on the show for State of Israel, and anybody else that wants to challenge that, you're more than welcome to come on. I don't say it out of hate or, whatever. But I'm just calling balls and strikes at this point, right? But that's another topic for another day. What I want to highlight is the fact that whether you agree with these young people or not, they're mobilizing, they're organizing, and they're having an impact in the discussion. The grievance pimps that are using reparations as their vehicle to get attention or whatever are not doing that. Now, elected officials like Alderwoman Simmons and some other folks I mentioned are like trying to do that work. The commission that was in California, right, where now there's actually a bill that the governor has got to sign dealing with reparations. That's action. That's what's needed. But none of these folks that are saying, oh, well, Vice President Harris ain't said nothing, Biden ain't said nothing, Trump. Have you mobilized 20,000 people to show up at these places of power to advocate for that? No. You've got all these folks that listen to you or follow you on social media, and there's been no call to action. Right? And if there has been a call to action, obviously it wasn't of the magnitude that would generate the interest. When those women were upset because Donald Trump got elected, they organized, and within literally weeks, I give them a couple months, they had organized protests not only in the United States, but around the world. There were literally thousands of people in every major city around the world protesting the election of Donald Trump and what that meant to the women's movement, right? %12 of this nation is African American. 12. You mean to tell me that an issue as important as repairing the damage that was done to us for hundreds of years in slavery, that we can't galvanize black folks to have demonstrations in every major city demanding reparations? We did it for police brutality. When we saw a black man, George Floyd, get killed on social media, we galvanized. And the country listened. We had corporate America saying, oh, we're friends with black people. And all these DEI experts got hired, right? If there's any group of people that can mobilize in the United States of America for a cause, it's been black folks. There is literally a holiday for a man who was never president of the United States because he was the spokesperson. He was the conscience of the nation, dealing with how black folks have been treated. He is in the American icon. There was a second level of Mount Rushmore, he would have his face carved in it. But none of you folks that try to blast every black person, and especially every black person that wasn't born in the United States, on social media and stuff, nobody's going to carve anything for you, because you're getting your reward right now. You're dealing with instant gratification. You're not dealing with a solution to the problem. And as long as there's a problem, you can pimp off of that. That's what I'm talking about. You can milk that for whatever benefits you get. You're not trying to solve the problem. All you're trying to do is exacerbate the problem enough and cause confusion and dissension enough so you can benefit from it. And that's a waste of my time and anybody else's time when you come across our timeline or our feed, because you're not about action. You want to be heard. You want to be seen. Great. But what are you going to do? See, nobody is going to threaten your life like Fred Hampton or Huey Newton, because you're not mobilizing anybody. Or Dr. King or Malcolm X. You're not mobilizing anybody. You're not a threat. You're entertainment. You know? It's like Beyonce is an actual entertainer, but she has mobilized people. Taylor Swift is an entertainer, but she's mobilized people. You have not. And that irritates me greatly, because you and your sycophants like this bubble that you got, and you want to crap on everybody else that calls you out or doesn't agree with you 100%, you'll never have them on your show or your spaces. You'll never invite people that disagree with you other than, you might want to troll them or have your folks pile on them, but you're not going to have a discussion about it because you're not about business. We got some folks still grieving about the vaccine. Really get over that right now. That's not important right now. That either 4 years ago you got the shot or you didn't. And if you're still with us and you didn't get the shot, praise God. If you didn't get COVID, praise God. I got COVID and I got the shot and I got the boosters. I'm done with that. I survived that. I have bigger fish to fry and focus on, right? But some of y'all ain't quite got over that yet. How you going to mobilize people on something that everybody has already made a decision one way or the other what they're going to do? Right? That's done. Either you got the shot or you didn't. That's over with. Either you got COVID or you didn't. That's over with. Basically. So what we're now looking at is, can we get somebody elected to the White House, to the U.S. Congress, to the governor's mansion, to the state assemblies that will entertain reparations? Now, the folks that want to end the war in Gaza are mobilizing. They are getting thousands of people to show up. They have people situated at presidential rallies. They're mobilizing. They're organizing. They're educating people on the issue. One of the most pleasant conversations I had in Chicago was his brother when I was coming to the protest to cover it. And we sat and talked. He didn't necessarily want to be interviewed, but he gave me enough background where I could ask intelligent questions, primarily because he was educating me on why they were doing what they were doing. And he was not just doing that to me. He was doing that to everybody. And he wasn't mad. He wasn't hostile. He wasn't, even if he felt that I didn't agree with him, his job was to educate, organize, and mobilize. And that's what you should be doing if you're talking about something serious as reparations. If you want to discriminate against immigrants, that's a whole nother issue, right? But I think that's a distraction to what you claim that you want. Because no matter what DNA test you put out there, no matter what criteria you set for it, if it's like, naturalized, born citizen, whatever, anybody black in the diaspora can make a claim, right? And that's something that the elected officials have to decide. And if you want to throw the criteria out there, but you think, that's good. But you individually just having so many clicks doesn't mean anything. What elected officials respond to is masses of people showing up where they work, demanding action. And if you're not about that life, if you're not about organizing and educating and mobilizing people, then you're wasting our time. And it's not just on reparations, it's any issue. You are wasting our time. And it's not me that gets to be the arbiter of credibility. It's on you. If you want to do something to make a change in the United States of America while we still have a democracy to do it in, you need to educate, organize, and mobilize. Period. If all you want to do is bitch and complain, good luck. As a Chicago sports fan, if me and thousands of others are displeased with the way a team that we support is performing, we stop going to the games. Might put paper bags over our heads. Whatever it is, people mobilize and they organize and they say, look, we're not happy with that. And then decisions get made. It happens every year. Whether it's Chicago, Las Vegas, New York, whatever, wherever city has a sports team, that happens. And it's natural. Because the common sense is that we're reaching the people because we believe that the people want to have a competitive team on the field, regardless of what sport it is. It's the same thing in politics. We want to believe that the folks that are elected have the best interests of the United States at heart. It's questionable nowadays because we've got a lot of grievance pimps that actually got elected, right? And the grievance pimp of all is Donald Trump. He's doing the exact opposite of what Reagan is doing. He's doing the exact opposite of what Kamala Harris is doing. Or Barack Obama or Bill Clinton. These people talked about hope. They talked about change. They talked about what America can do. They didn't sit there and say, oh, America's this sorry place and it's a hellhole and only I can fix it. I want y'all to follow the Electoral College. Donald Trump had 304 electoral votes in 2016. He dropped all the way down to 232. And my bold prediction is that he's barely going to get 200. Because the American people don't want to be told they're sorry. They don't want to be told they live in a hellhole. They don't want to be told that everything is bad. They want to see and they want to hear elected officials talk about how we are going to get better. And they want to see movement. So when you see these people show up at a Harris rally, that's movement. The most successful politicians in the history of America created movements for that election. Kennedy, Reagan, Clinton, Obama, and I predict Harris. It's about movements. It's not about sitting in your computer, on your phone, just griping. What are you going to do about it? When you see people organizing these massive Zoom meetings, that's action. That's how you win. That's how you change things. If all you are about is how many likes you have, how many clicks you get, that's not leadership. That's entertainment. If we are serious about reparations in America, it's time for movement. It's time for educating. It's time for organizing. It's time to mobilize. And there are people that have already started that. But instead of embracing or lending your skill set to movements that are happening, you want to do your own thing. You want to have your own corner. That's pimping. Or to use a drug analogy, that's pushing. That's not leadership. So, If you are satisfied in the window that you are in, that's you. But for the rest of us, we want to be part of a movement. So that's all I got to say on it. I've been active in organizations. I support people who are moving the needle forward. If there's anything I can contribute to the movement that's already out there, I am more than willing to do that. But I am not about pimping anybody. I'm not about grieving just to grieve. And if you want to counter and say, well, you criticizing us, that's a grievance. But I'm not trying to mobilize people. I'm not trying to take away your clicks. I'm not trying to take away your claim to fame. I'm just calling you out on what you're doing. My time and my contribution is anybody that supports reparations, I want you on the podcast so you can reach out to other people. I want to be a tool. Just like I want to be a tool to see Donald Trump no longer in office. Just like I want to be a tool to see American democracy restored. Just like I want to be a tool to make sure that African Americans achieve in this country. That's all I'm trying to do. I don't need to lead something where leaders already exist. I need to follow. I need to do my part to educate. I need to do my part to organize. I need to do my part to help mobilize people under the leadership that's legitimate and out there. I don't need to divide the nation to make the nation rise, because that's actually a contradiction. I need to unify the nation. I want people to feel positive about reparations like they changed their mind about LGBTQ. Like how they changed their mind about AIDS research. Like how they changed their mind about civil rights. I want to be part of a movement. And y'all that I'm talking about are not doing that. So I would strongly encourage you to take self out of it and be part of the movement. That's all I got to say, folks. Until next time.